Hey guys, it's Khalil,
Hey, it's Chad.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. Okay, so getting back on where we left off, we were talking about um, just really talking about the general theme of the far left being very similar to the far right as it relates to Marxist Leninism and Marxist Sorelism. Just looking at the connections between a lot of fascist states and a lot of socialist slash communist states. And so that's when we wanted to really talk about um, fascism through what it really can be considered to be nationalist, socialist, which, if anyone knows anything about Nazism, it is what that's literally the name of the party in Germany at the time, National Socialists. So then it starts to become really clear, like um of course, like as we've already explained and we're going to continue to explain, there were certain aspects of fascism as it was invented by Mussolini and then expanded upon and practiced by Hitler and the Nazis. There were aspects of fascism that were incredibly nationalist, but then there were also other aspects of it that were socialist for the people that they considered to be part of the state.
Yeah. And so it comes back to the idea. There's a lot of misconception of where people try to paint Nazi Germany as being a socialist because they have the socialist in the name. But of course, that's not the case. It took some aspects of socialism, and then it took more aspects of nationalism. Of course, like we said, National Socialism. And so when it came to Germany, it was more as they gave socialism to the people of the state. And for them, Germany made it more specific to the German people. And so like we said before, one of the aspects of fascism is that they define who the state is. For Italy, the state was the Italian people, the Italian race, and for Germany, it was the German race, which was a lot more specific than everyone who resided in Germany.
And then
Um,
they defined what that race was.
yeah,
They typically favored, white people because, so much of Europe, it is the people that are native to Europe, of course, are white people. And so when the case of Mussolini, which people don't know so much about, he favored like white Italians. He did not prefer like colonial Italians, although they helped to extend imperial control. And with Hitler and the Nazis, people probably know about how so much of uh um of the general like idea of what's the word I'm looking for? Pseudoscience was used to describe who was a real German. And so, of course, that excluded a lot of people, as Chad was saying, that spoke German, have been in Germany through their bloodline for hundreds of years, that have been considered German in every other like political system that Germany has been part of before, but suddenly under the Nazis, they weren't German. So it was incredibly specific, as Chad is about to mention. But amongst the people that were able to fit this racial classification, there is an argument that for those people, there are aspects of socialism that they can see in their everyday life.
yeah. One of the examples that you can look at that for is Italy. So after Italy became fascist in around like 1920s, early 1920s, so by like 1925, the Italian government was looking for, well, they were starting on a program to revamp their social like welfare and educational capabilities. Um, and so like around this time, they embarked on in providing food supplementary assistance for the people of the state, infant care, maternity assistance, general health care, wage supplements, paid vacations, unemployment benefits, illness insurance, disease insurance, general family insurance. So a lot of social, this is from a book by James Greger, and we'll have it in the sources, of course. But they were adding in a lot of welfare services that would be very characteristic of a socialist government. I mean, when you look at socialism, one of their tenets, of course, is the welfare of the people, and of course that comes through public spending. But you would providing for the people, unions and higher wages and unemployment benefits and care for the elderly. That's something you see in a socialist government. But with fascist Italy, they pursued those same kind of welfare programs because they wanted the people who were of the nation of Italy or of the Italian race who were helping the state to get something back. And that was kind of one of the that's again the Italian fascist government had some aspects of socialism for it because, as I said, they want the people of the state who are working for the state, they still wanted to benefit them. And that goes back to fascism's ideological roots all the way back to Marxism, which was a system that was aimed to provide a lot of benefits to the system. And that was something that Italy kind of pursued. Their execution was a little lackluster, but ideologically, that's what they go for. They incorporate some of the aspects of a socialist system in their kind of form of government.
Right. And obviously, the modern person looks very down upon a fascist system because of how destructive it was and how many people were killed as a result of that belief in that political system. Um, and like the scar it really has in the places that it was largest affected. Um, but it is interesting to take a little bit of an intellectual exploration as to what would a fascist state look like in peacetime, because the Nazis, they largely only ever knew war. They started a certain economic they started a certain economic policy called autarky, where they cut off most of their trade, and so they were already living like they were in a war, like as soon as the Nazis took absolute power by 1932-33. And um, the Italians, they had a bit of time, between the March on Rome in 1922 and the declaration of war in 1940. But I think I wonder sometimes. I wonder like what would they be like in peacetime? You
Yeah,
know, like because of course a lot of these social services would have to be suspended during the war because it's a national emergency. That happens a lot in national emergencies. But what would the Nazis have been like in peacetime?
yeah, it's certainly interesting because in some points it seemed contradictory to um, their kind of idea of self-sustained, self-supported government, that they would be, like you said, doing trade or working with other nations, making agreements like that. When the whole basis of your government is for the betterment of its people, you don't need to be depending on other governments, especially if they're liberal ones. Um, with our liberal system of government that a lot of the developed world has, we have things like trade agreements. We have the European Union. We have NAFTA. We have all these kind of things between liberal nations deciding what we trade for, all of that kind of stuff. Fascist countries, you'd come to assume, I don't think they would be trading a lot with other countries. And so you would have to have a lot of spending, of course, on these kind of welfare systems. And that you kind of have to wonder where they would get that money. And of course, that comes from higher taxes, higher, um, you would hope for imports, but like you said, then and that might not be trading a lot. But it would have to be it would be pretty hard to sustain like on a very, especially if it was a smaller country. It seems like it would be pretty hard to sustain if you're not fighting a war and gaining new territory because all you have is the resources that you got. And I'm kind of suspicious that they would be trading a lot in in peacetime.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing, but just just talking about like all the social services that you listed from Gregor's book, just it kind of reminds me of the of where we started with this series with Hobbes, the social contract, because Locke and Hobbes, they both had their own versions of a social contract, but with the fascist system, they have their own version of it that's interesting. Like um, as long as you provide for the state, as long as you have a job that like supports the state, um, then you will
You're being
have all the
provided
benefits
back
that
for.
come
Yeah.
from a citizen. Yes, and so yeah, I mean, it just yeah,
It's an
it's
interesting one to look at. Um, and a good comparison that you get once again, which goes back to our point of the far left and the far right, is what you get with communism. In a communist system, you look at the Soviet Union, people had state providing houses. You know, they had those big block apartments that everyone would have a guaranteed place to live in. And so you get that kind of provided state. So in a fascist one, you would likely get that same provided infrastructure for the people to kind of support them on a basic level. I do wonder just how sustainable that would be. Because like I said, if you're not expanding, which at the end of the day a lot of fascist governments would be doing. We saw that in World War II. It at Italy's new kind of you could call it imperialist movement to retake new land or old lands in North Africa and Greece and all that kind of stuff, and then Nazis Germany's expansion all throughout Western Europe. They needed that expansion to kind of, well, they that expansion helps them um, economically with their resources. You know, getting oil. Oil, of course, is one of the biggest commodities. Um, but if you have that kind of state, and especially with the fascist government, you're not going to be working with a lot of people. Yeah, you would have a lot of those social programs in the country going forward. I do wonder how long they would last.
right, which is what connects me to this quote from Mussolini himself in the Political and Social Doctrine of Fascism, where he explains his idea of what fascism is and and like how he came to the idea. So in page 236, he says, political doctrines pass, but humanity remains. And it may rather be expected that this will be a century of authority, a century of the left, a century of fascism, end quote. So yeah, he therefore, from that quote there, he says authority, left, and fascism as if they all like bundle together into one concept. And you have to imagine that is what's definitely going on into his head. And then again, you have to wonder, where did that come from? Where did that idea come from that the authority, the left, and fascism all roll up into one general thing? Because he's saying here that there have been all different types of political doctrines throughout history. That some help the people, some don't. You know, but if you're going to have a system that he interprets at the very least as left, fascism, that is based on authority, you know, it just, I wonder what Chad, what do you think of that? That he puts authority, the left, and fascism as all rolling up into one general concept.
Yeah, I see the authority part as one that always comes in every single one of those ideologies. The left, the right, all all have been taken advantage by authoritarian governments. And so that was something I see he maybe even got right. I don't know. I mean, the 20th century was not really defined by that. Liberalism ended up winning out, both with the Cold War and the end of World War II. But that still brought about communism, which of course was an authoritarian system. But the use of the quote to kind of define it as a century of both the left and of fascism, again, that kind of underlines one of the ideas of where fascism came from, and that's using the left. As we kind of laid out in some of the past episodes, um, the whole origin of fascism came from a man who was a socialist himself and took elements of socialism, the emphasis on the masses, the emphasis on reaching to their needs, to um, uniting the country or uniting a people. He took some of those elements and combined them with nationalism, as we kind of outlined, into what fascism is. And so fascism does not go without the left. It doesn't just come in a vacuum. It came from that left. If there was no Marxism, there would be no socialist um, ideology that Mussolini could have subscribed to, there wouldn't well, there probably would have been someone else to come up with it, but there would not have been the whole political realization of the importance of the crowd if um, leftists, the philosophers such as Marx and later Sorel would see the importance of the populist that a liberal system kind of made to be. I mean, the reason that the populace became so important is because the populace can vote. If they couldn't vote, such as in a king system, in a feudal system, where the populace, most of them are just serving as workers to some nobles who get to decide everything, there's no point in them. But again, due to a liberal system, the people have an ability to vote and ability to dictate the grander political landscape. And it was because different philosophers, like I said, like Karl Marx or Sorel, and what was the name of the other one who wrote The Crowd? We mentioned him before.
Le Bon.
Yeah, Le Bon. In his book The Crowd, people would take note of that, and those were leftist philosophers. There would be no fascism if those people wouldn't have pointed that out and use their own ideologies. I mean, they had their takes on them, but like I said, fascism took some of what they said and used it for their own goals, and then added a little more ideologies to it. But they don't just exist separately. They came from each other, and they have that kind of connection, even now.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if like fascism were to start from the right, there would be no aspect of it that relied so much on the people. There'd be no need to convince what the people think, because if it started from a rightist concept, as it was known at the time with like in the early 20th century, and establishing on the political background that existed throughout Europe in the 19th century, there wouldn't have been as much focus on the importance of the people. That's something that like needs to be understood, very much understood, for the for modern political thinkers. They need to understand that some of the most destructive political movements in history, they have origins in the left. And that's not to say that the left is terrible or that the right is perfect. It's just something that needs to be known. It needs to be known that that all populist movements that are nationalist or rightist, they started with the original leftist idea that the people matter,
Hmm.
because in the same page of the political and social doctrine of fascism, Mussolini also wrote, for if the 19th century was a century of individualism, it may be expected that this will be the century of collectivism, and hence the century of the state. End quote. So he looked at the 19th century and saw that it was an area, a time in history post French Revolution, in where Europe, which controlled so much of the world at the time, um, it it had this air of liberty that was spread by the French revolutionaries at the end of the 18th century, and in the early 19th century because of Napoleon. And so, as the 20th century came around and liberal movements began to gain more traction, and the way in how World War One was ended alongside like these sort of like liberal ideals of like self-determination, as we were describing earlier in our past episodes of this series, it's important, to create a certain sense of collectivism for that social harmony that's so important for a state, you know. So that's what Mussolini was talking about in this quote, that this is a century of collectivism, where you can achieve like the sort of social harmony, peace, and therefore the state is supreme, and the people will want it because it helps them. At least that was the idea. We all know how destructive fascism is now.
Yeah, but that idea of the collective having a huge importance of politics, as I said, traces its way all the way back to leftism and more the leftist interpretation of the populace that came from the idea of liberalism. Just think of this series altogether. That was one of our starting out ideas on how liberalism itself kind of led to all of this. It led to both Marx and to fascism. And it all came to be because of the liberalism of the people, and that was their like giving them the ability to have a say in their politics, a say who they voted for, a say of serving in government. I mean, that was a huge thing. You didn't have to be born into a noble family to be an aristocrat or to be in the parliament or to be the king. You could be anyone if you had the qualifications and maybe the people skills or the economic skills to be voted in. And like I said, there was a leftist interpretation of that liberation that fascists would end up using and kind of taking and implementing some of it. And then, like I said, adding in their stuff as well, adding in the nationalism, adding in some more of the imperialism, adding in some different but somewhat similar economic policies. It took some of that all, but it was all kind of from that basis of liberalism, and
Right.
of course the leftist interpretation of that.
Exactly. And it gets like the connection between the left and the right amongst intellectuals, and those that like study this information very heavily, political thinkers, is that it's almost hard to figure out like where it started, with fascism. Like was it a leftist thing that started from the right, or was it a rightist thing that started from the left? And clearly we have a certain opinion on this. We think it started with the left and then it became nationalist with the right. But, you know, um, while this particular person I'm about to quote doesn't 100% agree, it does help. He does help to solidify the point that that fascism really is a blend of left and right in certain aspects. It leans right, but on paper, at the very least, there are leftist things inside it. So, one of my favorite YouTube channels, that of course we're going to drop a link in the description for you. You know what we do now. Um, the Great War, and one of their biggest people that go up and speak, nowadays, since a few years ago, has been Jesse Alexander. And Jesse Alexander on this Great War YouTube channel, go check him out. He referred to Italian fascism as, quote, a reconceptualization of rightist themes with leftist vocabulary, end quote. So, he recognized like that connection, because the more that you learn about Italian fascism and even aspects of German fascism, there's just the idea there that it's hard to look at it in terms of left and right. Like we often like to look at like the fight between Hitler and Stalin as if they were complete opposites, but try to start with the idea that they might be more similar that you think, find evidence that supports it, and you'll be surprised how much is there.
Oh yeah, that quote was perfect because I think it perfectly encapsulates what we've been trying to say here. Is that it takes a leftist perspective, it takes some of the leftist vocabulary. Like you said, vocabulary is a way of expressing the ideas. It's a way of doing something. It took their, one of the words this way, took their methods and then adding in more of the nationalist ideas, the myths, that what's we said, like what we've said in the past couple episodes. They added in the nationalist idea into and used some of the socialist and Marxist leftist methods to get it in there. So it's kind of a blend. It's not just one. It's not just one side or the other. While it is pretty clearly in their view, it is very rightist, and I wouldn't say conservative, but more on the right leaning of the scale, if you use a left right kind of scale. But it's a blend. And like I said, the vocabulary part was one I found really interesting because we have some quotes which say somewhat similar things about their views of like the individual and how they serve the state. And so I have a quote from Friedrich Hegel. And so Hegel, who Mussolini recognized as the philosopher of the state, wrote that is a state is then well constituted and internally powerful when the private interest of its citizens is one with the common interest of the state. So with that quote, he's kind of saying that the state is most powerful when the people are basically on the same page as the state. They'd want to do the same thing that the state do. They, like I said, they kind of agree with everything. There's no internal division, no protest. The state's acting in the will of the people, and the people are acting in the will of the state. You know, it seems like a very, rightist idea. But when you look at it, there's a very big parallel to what Mao said in his view of Marxist-Leninism. And so this is a quote from Mao Zedong, in which he said, "At no time and in no circumstances should a communist place his personal interest first. He should subordinate to the interest of the nation and the masses. Hence, selfishness, slacking, corruption, seeking the limelight are most incompatible, while working with all one's energy, wholehearted devotion to public duty, and quiet hard work will command respect." He's kind of saying the same things as Hegel was saying. When the person's ideas, their interests are in the same pay or are subordinated to the state, that's when their government is the most powerful. That's what the people should do in, for Mao it was the communist government, but for Hegel it was the fascist government. But they're saying essentially the same thing. Their person's interest should be subordinated to the state. And while Hegel explicitly said that it should be in the same interest, it's implied again in the communist point of view that the state will be acting in the realm of the people. That's again, it's using fascism in and what's his name in the quote that we just said, in which it uses leftist vocabulary and rightist ideas. That's what it's doing. It's with Hegel, he was saying something that communists would end up saying almost very close to being word for word. And so I found that as it very much goes with what we've been trying to say. And as we wrap this up, I'm kind of reaching the time. That's definitely one of the big parts that we want to get through with this kind of series.
Right. So, we've spoken a lot so far about that connection between the left and the right. And I think out of all the episodes up until now, with this series, this one has really been the one where I hope you guys really get it, because up until this point, it's been a lot of like familiarizing you with the intellectual part of this discussion, because of course, this is a very intellectual channel, but it was very important that you knew about Mussolini's backstory. It was very important you knew about Germany and Italy's history. It was very important that you knew about Sorel, as well as like how it links and separates from Lenin's view, and just the whole concept of a nation or a state as authority, so we wanted to introduce you guys to all those ideas, but I hope with this episode we can really like help to like crunch it all together. And we have more to say, and we'll continue to say it, but that'll be all for now. We'll be back, and we are the Marshals of Truth. All right. So, like, subscribe, bless the YouTube algorithm, send it to everybody. People you think would be interested, people you think you wouldn't. We want to see, just how much attraction, how much interest we can get in these ideas, because we think they're interesting. Hopefully you guys find it interesting, and hopefully many others will find it interesting. So
Yeah.
spreading is the best thing we can do.
Show it, agree, disagree. And if you disagree, tell us. Tell us in the comments. Maybe you'll point something out that we missed. And that's what we're all here for. We're here for learning. We're here for testing out ideas. And if you got something new, let us know. Maybe it'll be the next topic of another episode. So yeah. With that, that's about it. We'll see you in the next episode.
All right, yo.